Hello, welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Battery Storage Podcast. And today we have a guest coming to us all the way from Shanghai, China, Mr. Andy Klump. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill. I'm happy to be on.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you. You are the founder and CEO of Clean Energy Associates. And this is your company. This is an American company, your company. But you're sitting in Shanghai, China, and you have an interesting life story and career story. I'll just give the audience just a few details. Andy's from St. Louis originally. You've got your BA from Northwestern and your MBA from Harvard Business School. And you've had a really interesting career. You've done a stint with Intel, sales with Dell Computer. I think you helped found Trina Solar. You've got a really rich career history that led to where you are. But why don't I let you give the audience a flavor of that, and then we can go from there.
Perfect. I will say everything was correct, except I did not found Trina Solar. I was one of the early team members, so I joined when they had about 500 folks, but I was the first non-Chinese member of their executive management team. So there's an interesting story or two behind that. But look, to back up, once again, I grew up in St. Louis, and ironically, my high school was the first one in the Midwest that actually had Mandarin offered. But I grew up in the 90s in St. Louis saying, why would I ever study Chinese? It seemed like a foreign concept. So I studied French, never used it, but consequently, but I always had an interest in travel and pursuing a life abroad. I never lived outside the country until I had the chance to come to China, and I traveled first to China in 2001 as a tourist while I was in business school. Absolutely loved it. And I said, I absolutely have to learn the language, understand the culture. And so I went down a path of my second year of business school to study Chinese on the side. And then I said, come hell or high water, I'm going to make the trip to China. And so I took a full-time job with Dell Computer. I had a small stint with Intel, and then made a shift from high tech to clean tech in 2006 when I worked at Trina Solar. So it's kind of an unusual path, but I ended up with landing on my feet in China.
And what was that transition like in terms of going from tech, straight up tech, to clean tech or energy tech? Why don't we start with that?
It was a really interesting time in the market. And I really, once again, I guess to give a little more background on my my work history, when I finished up at Northwestern, I did have a little stint in the late 90s in the high-tech sector, working first in Austin, Texas with a software company, and then later with an internet services company in Chicago and Atlanta. I enjoyed working at high-tempo, fast-paced, high-growth companies. And when I entered business school in 2001, it was right at the start of the recession, and I thought everything would be great when I came out in 2003, and that clearly was not the case. But I had a trip to Southeast Asia right before business school. I had a little bit of wanderlust in me, and I said, I had such a good time traveling around. Let me try to stake my claim in one spot. And I looked through different markets, and I just said, I just have to be in mainland China. The language is so different. The culture was dramatically different than anything I knew. And so after spending a couple months on the ground in Shanghai, I just said, I'm absolutely going to come here. And so that's why I was just very, very dedicated to studying Mandarin during my second year of business school. And then I said, I want to stake a claim in China, but I first want to start with an international company. So that's why I started off with Dell Computer, because I thought they might benefit from my international background and upbringing. Nothing could have been further from the truth. In 2003, the market was already highly localized. I had no competitive advantage whatsoever. The whole trend of expats was kind of dying, and there were a number of half-pats like myself who took massive pay cuts to go to China. But I said, look, this is where my heart's taken me. I've got to try it out. And I sure as heck did not want to be the first one from Harvard Business School to get fired after 6 months. But they told me, if you don't hit your quota the first 2 quarters, you're out. And I had a six-figure debt that I had to pay off. So I was highly motivated to hit my numbers and to figure it out. But it was definitely jumping in to the deep end.
Yeah, that must have been scary when you're in a sales position and it's getting down to the wire. And as a young professional, and as you said, you've got probably student loan debt or whatever it was, and trying to just meet that. And there's probably a lot of lawyers out there who can relate to that last point about debt. I went through that a little bit of that back in the day, but just an interesting path. Well, tell me about when you decided to start Clean Energy Associates.
I guess I should back up a little bit. When I went to Trina Solar, one of the reasons I was just super passionate about entering the solar industry is I thought, wow, this is a phenomenal market. I said it still seemed at the very early stage, hardly any market research on any of the Chinese companies. But I will say one of the trends I noticed, and in my experience with Dell, I had the habit of visiting a lot of clients on a daily basis, had 20 meetings a week. So I was constantly going to different facilities and visiting different manufacturing shops. And so I saw that the different types of operating styles. And when I went to visit my first solar factory at the time, I had an interview with Trina Solar. I just thought, this is amazing. It's just a bunch of disparate systems. There's no continuous flow. It's all just kind of like a bunch of job shops. And I just said, this seems like a very, very early stage cottage industry. And if I just think of the need for energy, this is eventually going to grow. And if there's anywhere close to the projections in terms of cost reduction, there's a lot of potential. So I spent the better part of 2 years at Trina Solar helping build up the company. I was part of the company's IPO on the New York Stock Exchange in 2006. And then we effectively grew the company about 10x in every metric and over the course of 2 years. So after 2 years, I kind of came to the point where I said, look, I'm tired of traveling around the world and hardly ever seeing my wife. I just gotten married a year before, and my wife is from Dallas, Texas. And so I said, I want to stay married to her and forge down the entrepreneurial path. So I set up CEA in 2008, right after another global financial crisis. And so it was a very interesting path those first few years. But we kind of found our way, kind of worked through a lot of market fluctuations and started to grow and scale the business. And so that's where we've expanded now with a presence in 13 countries. We have teams in roughly 190 around the world. And we completed over 125 gigawatts of engagements of solar and about 8 gigawatt hours of energy storage. So it's been a wild ride over the last 14 years.
That sounds like a tremendous ride. Most importantly, though, because I'm an NFL fan, is your wife a Dallas Cowboys fan?
She is absolutely a Dallas Cowboys fan.
And how do you get the games? Do you get the games over there?
There are bars that you can go and watch the game. They pretty much are out there when it's playoff time. So there's quite a few foreigners who go and will watch. So football is not a big pastime yet, but there's plenty of options to watch the games.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, of course, I go into the frivolous when you just ran through how successful CEA has been and the tremendous amount between Trina Solar and CEA, the tremendous amount of renewable development and now storage that you've been involved in. And we should probably turn to that. In terms of CEA, I mean, right now it seems like your company would be certainly well positioned to help with a lot of the challenges, that unprecedented challenges, I would say, that developers probably face and other entities face just in terms of managing supply chain issues, managing commodity issues. Why don't you just tell me a little bit about sort of the typical, I know maybe typical is not the right word because it sounds like you guys do a variety of services, but just, tell us about some of the things that CEA could help companies navigate in today's world.
Absolutely. So if I had to really characterize it, we have 4 different business units, but it's really kind of covering the whole life cycle of a solar energy storage project. So we help people buy things. We help inspect in the factory because you don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. And then third, we actually do the final checks on the site where the deployments are happening. And then finally, we have a 4th team that basically tracks all the data and makes sure that we put that in a way that our clients can digest that, doing market intelligence. So once again, supply chain, helping make procurement decisions. The second was the quality assurance, checking the factory. The third was our engineering services at the job location. And then finally, the market intelligence team. So we run each of those groups as separate P&Ls.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about one of those, just because I have a personal interest in it. Because I was involved in a case where there was a solar development. I wouldn't say it went bad. It ultimately ended up getting built, but there was a dispute between the prime contractor and the sub, and we represented the sub. And I don't want to get too into details of that, but it ended up settling out. And so for client confidentiality purposes, I won't go too much further into it. But I'll just give you the sort of, hypothetically speaking, there was a project in upstate New York, and it ended up going bad in the sense that the actual site ended up being something other than what I think the sub was led to believe, maybe. And so there were problems with literally moving the purlins, which are the metal
Mhm.
brackets basically that you end up affixing
Sure.
the solar panels to. And it was because of this ridiculously steep hill that they had to go up, and it was muddy, and it was just a mess. And the project ended up into significant cost overruns and delays. And so, is that the kind of thing where CEA, as you say, goes in and looks at the site, and that's the kind of thing that you guys might have been able to help with?
Yes, absolutely. We could certainly help with anything from early stage design to helping and provide the owner's engineering oversight on the job. So once again, in that case, we would often be hired by the developer or the IPP that's actually owning the project, and so they want to make sure that the EPC that's constructing and building the project is actually following the right industry standards and can help avoid those problems that happen. Quite often, we're brought in after the fact. Once again, there's a lot of extreme weather events, many cases of microcracks and undetected problems occur maybe during installation. And so we find that we're brought in because a high number of systems are underperforming. So once again, that's part of our engineering services team that resides both in the US as well as in Europe. And so we go to a number of countries to remediate those type of challenges.
Yeah, people don't realize a solar installation, because it's so it's so ubiquitous at this point. There are certain aspects of it that are highly technical. The panels have to be put in a very precise way. The purlins have to line up in a very precise way. I'm not an engineer, but I learned a lot through that case. So that's the kind of thing that you guys could jump in and help quite a bit with. Well, let me ask you this.
Absolutely. If you look at all the issues related to poor quality, once again, it can cause a lot of delays. A lot of safety risk. We've had a lot of cases we've been brought in because there have been fires on rooftops or in utility scale installations, and so once again, it leads to underperformance and warranty claims. And so once again, we handle a whole host of those type of issues for both large utility scale as well as CNI and in some cases residential buyers and owners of these systems.
Yeah, and on the storage side, that fire risk is obviously real. I mean, you've had real cases here in the United States. Arizona is a notable one where, if you don't handle the particular lithium-ion batteries in the right way, you create a fire risk, and it can be a real dangerous situation. So, appreciate that you guys can advise on those things. Safety, yeah, I mean, that was another issue in the case I was involved in. Is there were here in the United States, there were OSHA issues, and it was a mess. But in any event, one of the things I am pointing to here, there was a report that, and I have no connection, the firm has no connection with Wood Mackenzie, but they're another advisory, and you could pick up this report at woodmac.com. Well, the only reason I mention it is just came out March 2020. It just shows the explosive growth in battery storage deployments, and it talks about there were basically 257 megawatts in 2016. This is the United States. U.S. annual energy storage deployments across all market segments. And then in 2021, you've got 3,508.6 megawatts, and that's a 1,263% increase in deployments. I was told there'd be no math, but somebody else did the math for me. And if you look at megawatt hours, which is a different way of looking at storage, it's a similar type of picture. So with that explosive growth in storage, and in particular here in the United States, tremendous growth in storage, how has your company pivoted into that? Because, it started out like with Trina and maybe the time you're talking about there, it was solar and wind to some extent, right? That was the big growth picture. Now you've got storage onto the scene, and that's got explosive growth. So how has CEA pivoted into that space?
Well, I will say we certainly didn't pivot. We had many years of tracking the energy storage market and planning our expansion of our team, but we actually have gone through pretty strong growth in terms of demand for those services, and we're certainly on the hockey stick of a very high trajectory. But just to back up a second, I mean, my first visit to a battery facility was back in 2011. I was invited by one of the investors to take a look at one of their investments. And I was eyeing the market very closely, but it was still a very expensive technology. But really around 2014, we had some of our largest clients start to call us and say, hey, we want to start visiting some of these battery cell manufacturers. Can you take us around? So we started doing that in China and Korea and the like, and really helping to establish relationships with some of the up and comers. I mean, at that point in time, it's still Samsung, LG, and you have Panasonic that really dominated the market. But lo and behold, once again, a number of folks started to grow and expand, and then the cost started to come down as the EV market took off. And so once again, you have to think that stationary energy storage is still the gnat on the back of an elephant, and the giant growth in EVs has caused massive expansions of major battery cell manufacturers. So CE does a lot of work about tracking the capacities of these manufacturers, providing that market intelligence to our clients, but really helping to identify who are the right suppliers, and also to make sure these contracts are actually being executed. Because the reality is there have been a lot of increases in key raw material inputs, and so a lot of manufacturers are now going back and trying to retrade contracts, and it's a very tricky time in the industry. But I will definitely say it's also crucial, and this is one of the key services we provide, is having the inspectors on the ground, both at battery cell level and also the module, in the battery pack. That's extremely important. A lot of people don't realize, but I had a CTO of a top 5 manufacturer tell me, oh, well, we always have a little bit of B grade product, but we always have to give the A grade product to the EV players. And I was like, well, why is that? He said, well, their teams are in there inspecting. And I said, well, who do you give the B grade product? Well, we sell that to the energy storage guys because they don't send anyone to check. So
now that is a scary statement, but this audience should pay attention to that, because as much as we've had guests on talking about the EV sector and the crossover potential between EV sector and stationary in some of our past episodes, but I think a good chunk of our audience is really more focused on the utility scale stationary application. So maybe what your contact was referring to is the energy storage guys, and so you really got to understand what you're getting, and that's a key point that you brought up that I don't think we've ever talked about before this podcast. So that I appreciate that nugget. That's a really important point, I think, that you're raising, that you could, just because you're not paying attention, you're getting a lesser grade product, perhaps.
Absolutely, and the reality is, manufacturers who are working in the factories, they don't often know where the product's going. And so once again, you're dealing with a sales guy who's in another country or is just new to the job. They don't know the manufacturing facilities. And that's part of the reality, is that right now we have travel restrictions. It's very difficult to get into China if you're not very connected or have your own company here. So that's where, once again, we have a 90+ person team here in China doing these inspections. The head of our QA team, he has 20 years of battery cell manufacturing experience, including 10 years at Panasonic. So we've developed a lot of proprietary approaches to knowing how the product gets made and make sure that we're not bamboozled in the process. So you have to hire independent third-party inspectors who are very knowledgeable. You can't just throw anyone into the factory, otherwise they're not going to know what's going on.
Really interesting to know that, hear that. Well, let me ask you, your company just put out what I guess in the law firm world we would call a client alert, but it's a paper basically about the U.S. Department of Commerce, the anti-circumvention investigation that the U.S. Department of Commerce has begun. And it seems like it could have far-reaching implications. Your company put out this paper on March 28th, and it's available on your website. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about this anti-circumvention investigation and ways that CEA might be able to help?
Absolutely. So once again, the anti-dumping and countervailing duties case that has been brought about by the Department of Commerce is a major development in the solar industry, because it does target 4 key countries that are the primary producers of modules that are destined for the U.S. And once again, that's in Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And those 4 countries account for roughly 85% of the imports that went to the U.S. in 2021. And there is a potential for a retroactive ruling, which would effectively could encompass all modules that are imported into the U.S. right now. And it could go as far back as November of 2021. So right now, we're helping a number of developers, EPCs, and IPPs who are now faced with the reality that their projects may have a large increase in duties, and they may, depending on how they structure their contract, they may be paying these after the fact. And so we do have a team that's focused on market intelligence who follows and tracks all the policy developments. We have teams that are closely in discussion with a number of parties who are obviously trying to fight against this. We've been approached by folks in the industry who want to use our knowledge and insights to help guide this investigation And the reality is the solar supply chain is very convoluted, but there have been cases that have happened as early as 2012 in our sector against solar cells made out of China, and those duties are still in place. So once again, once the Department of Commerce chooses to start an investigation, there's a high likelihood that there will be some type of duty that is put in place and may potentially be in place for a decade or more. So different players in this space absolutely need to know what's going on and see as a source of truth around where the supply chain is and what parts of the supply chain are not impacted. Because there still are manufacturing facilities that are in different locations. And so we know one way or the other, the solar market will grow and expand, but there may be a period of indecision for some of these facilities that are in these regions.
I think the scariest part of that is the retroactivity, right? I mean, well, it's all, creates a challenge if you're in that space. But going back in time, if there's one thing I've learned is that clients don't like surprises. So if you feel like, okay, we've got this project done and it's in the past and it's water under the bridge, well, it might not be. So that is a particular scary aspect to all of this. So I think that's something I'm sure you guys are going to be heavily involved in going forward, and it's something that the entire industry here in the States is going to have to deal with.
It's certainly a scary phenomenon for some, but I will also comment what we are seeing is a massive pivot of manufacturing capacity in different locations. There are regions like India that are growing quite aggressively right now, and there are a number of multi-gigawatt manufacturers that are now expanding quite aggressively. There's roughly 20 gigawatts of new capacity expansions throughout India. We also have a 15-person team on the ground there, so a lot of our clients have pivoted to those manufacturing facilities. And once again, there are manufacturing facilities that are going to jump up in different regions, including the U.S. And that's where we do have a team with on-the-ground manufacturing experience in the U.S., and we do see U.S. manufacturers starting to grow and expand. So I will expect that there are going to be more manufacturing locations that pop up in the U.S. But our common theme that we've seen in our 14 years of history and our 125 gigawatts of engagements is the fact that new facilities almost always have problems. It doesn't matter if they're in the US, India, China, or Southeast Asia. So whenever there is a new manufacturing facility, one absolutely must engage an independent third party with the right know-how to ensure that they're getting high quality product. And we've had cases of US manufacturers who actually had worse quality than what we've seen in Southeast Asia or China. So even in the US, a new facility still has a lot of risk.
I neglected to ask you about your team here in the United States, because obviously probably a big part of our audience is most focused on the domestic situation here in the States. Just tell me really quickly about CEA's team here on the ground in the United States.
I established CEA once again in 2008, first in Hong Kong and then later in China. But in 2013, we set up an entity in the US and started hiring and building a team. And we've now grown that team to over 60 professionals. And most of those folks are inspectors and engineers, as I mentioned, who are often on rooftops or in field installations. And we have separate teams focused on field owners engineering, independent engineering, as well as field engineering. But we also have various folks around supply chain and quality who have background and knowledge to help support those who are executing projects on the ground and require us to be in different manufacturing facilities. And it's not just solar modules, but it's also, once again, inverters, trackers, every other balance of system component. Then also on the energy storage side, we have professionals in that domain as well. So we have built and grown a strong team in the U.S. over the last 9 years, and we're going to continue to grow and expand as long as there are massive deployments. And the U.S. solar market will continue to grow. So we do see this as kind of a short-term hiccup, but the long-term prognosis is very strong. So we're going to continue to expand with the market needs.
I totally agree with you. Everything I see in the market, even though maybe temporarily with the situation, things going on, with the conflict in Ukraine, there's concerns about natural gas supply, oil supply, those sorts of things. But the macro trend here in the United States is to try to get to net zero, so to speak, in many different scenarios, whether they be corporate or individual states or the federal government. In other words, the drive is to try to deploy solar, wind, storage, other forms of renewable energy. And I think there'll always be a place for some baseload resources, but it's going to be a continual movement towards the greater deployment of renewables. I think if you're in that space of being able to assist developers, clients, off-takers, whoever, in the solar development process, in the storage development process, et cetera, I think you'll have a lot of work going forward because that's the pace of development is not going to slow down.
Completely agree with the macro trend. And once again, there's a greater awareness in the industry than ever before for the need for renewable deployment. This is happening not just on solar, but also on wind. But as we talked about, the reason energy storage has grown so dramatically is there's a massive attachment rate for all of these renewable energy deployments. So we will see growing market and a lot more demand for energy coming from renewables. And it's driven not just by, it's driven across the board. It's not just utilities that are now demanding this. This is also the RE100 corporates, even oil and gas majors are getting into this space. So we do have clients in each of these segments. And, there's also increasing demand from the market around traceability and ESG. And so folks want to know, where are their products coming from? What is the carbon content of that product? And what's their overall footprint? That is also an area over the last year or two. We've grown a big team around traceability and ESG. And so that's also where, once again, CA looks holistically at the broader set of needs and challenges our clients are facing. And we're responding to that need with the solution. So that's going to be an ongoing trend we're going to continue to see as well.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time today to visit with us. A lot of interesting issues. Appreciate the client alert that you guys put out on the anti-circumvention investigation. And please stay in touch with us. Maybe we'll have you on again in the future because it seems like you guys are right in the middle of a lot of interesting issues, helping clients navigate a lot of complicated issues in today's world with all the different challenges, supply chain, conflict in Europe, which I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, and other things that are going on in the world. So again, we really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us, Andy, and we wish you and your company the best of luck going forward.
Excellent, Bill. Thanks again for the invitation. And once again, anyone who would like to download a free copy of our circular on this topic, just go to cleanenergyassociates.com or feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to have the dialogue, Bill. So look forward to being on again.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.